Bones crunch under heavy boots before the Lycan king even enters the courtyard. Every human in Tarnstead drops to the mud. Spines curved, eyes locked on the dirt. All except one. Rowena stood there, freezing rain soaking her woolen tunic, a scarred brand burning on her collarbone. She looked at the 7-foot apex predator walking toward her, and she kept her chin up. What he did next didn't just break centuries of law, it nearly tore his kingdom apart. The salt stung the deep cracks in Rowena's knuckles, but she kept rubbing it into the pale, cold flesh of the butchered swine. Winter had come early to Tarnstead. The mud in the village square had frozen into jagged ruts overnight, turning the ground into a treacherous landscape of hardened clay and ice. Every breath plumed white in the grey morning air. Rowena did not look up when the first warning bell tolled. It was a hollow, flat sound. Iron striking iron from the watchtower. It didn't ring with urgency or panic. It carried the dull, inevitable weight of a funeral dirge. The Lycans were coming. The winter tithe was due. Around her, the village erupted into a muted, frantic scramble. Men dragged sacks of grain out of root cellars, their faces pale and drawn. Women pulled their children indoors, latching wooden shutters that would do absolutely nothing against a determined werewolf, but offered the illusion of a barrier. Dogs slunk under porches, tails tucked tightly between their hind legs, whimpering. Animals always knew before the humans did. They smelled the shift in the wind. They smelled the apex. Rowena finished salting the hamstring. She wiped her hands on a coarse linen rag, her movements slow and methodical. She was 26, but her joints ached like an old woman's in the damp cold. A jagged, crescent-shaped scar sat high on her right collarbone, thick and keloided. It throbbed a dull rhythm against her skin, reacting to the dropping temperature, or perhaps reacting to the scent of wet fur and ozone that was just beginning to drift over the tree line. Rowena, Cobb, the village headman, was hobbling across the frozen mud, a ledger clutched to his chest. He was sweating despite the freezing air. "Get the meat to the square. Leave the salt. Just get it to the square. The vanguard is already past the river." "It's half-cured, Cobb," Rowena said, her voice raspy from disuse. "They eat it now. They'll get sick. Or do Lycans not get worms?" "Don't speak like that," Cobb hissed, his eyes darting toward the tree line. "Don't even think like that. If they hear you. They are 3 miles out. If they can hear me over the wind, we're already dead." Rowena tossed the rag onto the cutting block. She grabbed the heavy wooden trough filled with pork and hoisted it onto her hip. The weight sent a sharp spike of pain down her spine, but she ignored it. Pain was just another neighbor in Tarnstead. You acknowledged it, and kept moving. She walked to the village square, boots crunching over the frozen ruts. A line was already forming. The humans of Tarnstead arranged themselves in rows, standing before their meager offerings of root vegetables, dried fish, and meager livestock. There was no honor in this survival. The treaty signed a century ago was simple. The humans provided labor and sustenance, and the Lycans did not slaughter them for sport. The Northern Ridge Pack was brutal, efficient, and thoroughly unconcerned with human comfort. They viewed the villagers the way a farmer viewed a flock of sheep. Useful, expendable, subservient. A low, deep vibration rattled through the soles of Rowena's boots. It wasn't sound. It was sheer mass displacing the earth. The vanguard arrived first. 10 Lycan warriors emerged from the tree line. They did not ride horses. Horses terrified too easily around them. They walked. In their human forms they were massive, barrel-chested men clad in boiled leather, heavy iron plates, and wolf-pelt cloaks. They moved with a terrifying, fluid grace that betrayed their true nature. A human in heavy armor clanked and stumbled. These men glided, their heavy boots making calculated silent contact with the frozen earth. The stench of them washed over the square. It was a potent, musky odor. Wet earth, copper, pine needles and raw meat. Rowena's stomach tightened, a purely biological response to a predator. She swallowed the bile and set her wooden trough down beside a pile of miserable-looking turnips. Then the horns blew. A deep, guttural blast that seemed to vibrate behind Rowena's eyes. "Down!" Cobb whispered fiercely, dropping to his knees. "Everyone down! The king!" Around Rowena, 200 villagers collapsed into the mud and ice. They folded in on themselves, pressing their foreheads to the freezing ground, exposing the napes of their necks in the universal gesture of absolute submission. The rustle of coarse wool and the chattering of teeth filled the silence. Rowena looked at the ground. Directly in front of her boots lay a frozen puddle of pig blood, horse urine, and half-thawed mud. She looked at her knees. She was wearing her only good pair of thick wool trousers. She had spent 3 weeks weaving the fabric, another 2 dyeing it with crushed walnuts. Rowena sighed, a thin puff of white mist escaping her lips. She didn't kneel. The king of the northern ridge did not walk like a conqueror. He walked like a man exhausted by the sheer weight of his own existence. Gideon crossed into the square. He was taller than his vanguard, broad-shouldered and heavily scarred. He wore no golden crown, only a jagged circlet of dark iron, woven with bone resting against his coarse black hair. His armor was battered steel, dull and scratched from countless battles, layered over thick pelts. He carried no weapon in his hands, but a massive broadsword was strapped to his back, the hilt worn smooth from use. Rowena watched him from her standing position. She felt the immediate, suffocating pressure of his aura. It was a physical weight in the air, pushing down on her shoulders, demanding compliance. Her instincts screamed at her to drop, to grovel, to hide. Her muscles twitched, fighting her brain's stubborn refusal to submit. She crossed her arms over her chest, tucking her cold hands into her armpits, and waited. Gideon walked down the line of prostrate villagers. His boots left deep, heavy impressions in the frost. He didn't look at the offerings. He didn't care about the turnips or the pork. He was looking at the backs of their necks. The Lycans used the tithe to check the health of their human herds, to root out disease, rebellion, or fear. The silence in the square was absolute, broken only by the crunch of his boots and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the vanguard. A guard flanking the king suddenly stopped. His head snapped toward the back row. He let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated in his chest. Gideon paused. He turned his massive head slowly, his eyes locked onto Rowena. They were not the bright, magical gold of tavern songs. They were the flat, muddy yellow of a dying sun hitting dirty brass, unforgiving, calculating, wild. He stared at her. She stood there, the only vertical line in a sea of horizontal bodies. A lone woman in patched wool and a stained leather apron, arms crossed, staring back at the apex predator of the realm. Cobb, kneeling beside her, risked peeking through his fingers. He let out a strangled, pathetic sound. His hand shot out, grabbing the hem of Rowena's trousers, pulling down hard. "Rowena, you stupid girl!" He sobbed into the mud. "Get down! He'll kill us all!" Rowena stepped neatly out of Cobb's grip. She didn't break eye contact with the king. "Let go of my pants, Cobb," she said. Her voice carried in the silent square. It wasn't a shout. It was a conversational, weary tone. They're newly washed. The vanguard guard bared his teeth. Real teeth. Canines that elongated as the man's jaw shifted, bone popping audibly as he stepped forward, his hand dropping to the hilt of his axe. "Human!" The guard snarled, a wet, guttural sound. "You will present your neck to the crown." Rowena shifted her weight to her left leg. Her right knee throbbed. "The ground is wet," she said. The guard ripped his axe from his belt. The sound of steel clearing leather was sharp and deafening. Several villagers shrieked and covered their heads. Cobb began to pray rapidly under his breath. Rowena didn't flinch. She watched the guard approach, measuring the distance. She had a butchering knife in her boot, but she knew she wouldn't reach it in time. Even if she did, the blade would snap against the Lycan's ribs. She accepted the impending violence with the same cynical detachment she applied to the coming winter. She was tired. She was so incredibly tired. If this was how it ended, at least she wouldn't die with pig manure on her knees. Enough. The word was spoken softly. It wasn't a roar. It didn't need to be. Gideon's voice was like grinding stones deep underground. The guard froze mid-stride. The axe lowered instantly. The Lycan stepped back, bowing his head, submissive to the single syllable. Gideon began to walk toward Rowena. Every step he took felt like a hammer blow against the frozen earth. As he drew closer, his sheer size became overwhelming. He was a mountain of muscle and scarred skin. The scent of him was thick, suffocating. Up close, Rowena saw the map of violence etched into his face, a long, jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow down to his heavy jaw. He looked weary, deeply, fundamentally weary. He stopped 2 feet in front of her. Rowena had to tilt her head all the way back to meet his gaze. Her neck strained. Her heart was beating a frantic, bruising rhythm against her ribs, betraying the calm exterior she was desperately trying to maintain. He looked down at her. His flat yellow eyes studied her face. He noted the dark circles under her eyes, the chapped lips, the dirt smudged across her cheek. He didn't look angry. He looked curious. A terrible, dangerous curiosity. "You refuse to yield to your king," Gideon stated. It wasn't a question. "You aren't my king," Rowena said flatly. "You're my landlord, and I paid my rent. The pork is in the trough." A collective gasp sucked the remaining air out of the square. Cobb began to weep openly into the mud. Gideon didn't blink. He tilted his head slightly. "You are insolent. Arrogance in prey is usually a sign of stupidity." "I'm not arrogant," Rowena replied, her breath pluming white between them. "I'm practical. If you're going to kill me, you'll do it whether I'm standing or kneeling. The only difference is the laundry I'll leave behind." A low sound rumbled in Gideon's chest. It took Rowena a second to realize it wasn't a growl. It was a hum of amusement. Then his gaze drifted downward. It caught on her collarbone. The collar of her tunic was loose, exposing the thick, raised lines of the brand. The crescent moon with a slash through the center. The mark of the cull. Gideon's expression changed. The weariness vanished, replaced by a sudden, intense sharpness. The air around them seemed to crackle, the atmospheric pressure dropping so fast, Rowena felt her ears pop. "Where did you get that?" Gideon asked. His voice was no longer a rumble. It was a blade. Rowena felt a cold sweat break out on her back. 10 years ago, at the Red Ridge border, a pack marked the survivors of a raid so they couldn't blend in with the refugees. You survived a Red Ridge purge, obviously. They do not leave survivors. They leave warnings. The marked are meant to die slowly, to rot. Gideon took a half-step closer. His massive chest nearly brushed her nose. "Yet you stand here, complaining about the mud. I survived. I walked back. I butchered pigs. Life went on." Rowena held his gaze, refusing to let him see the phantom pain that still gripped her chest when she remembered the screaming, the fire, the smell of burning flesh. "If you're going to finish their job, get it over with." Gideon stared at her. For 10 long seconds, the world stopped spinning. The vanguard stood rigid. The villagers held their breath. Then, the Lycan king did the unthinkable. He didn't draw his sword. He didn't reach for her throat. Gideon unclasped the heavy iron brooch, holding his wolf pelt cloak. The heavy fur dropped to the frozen mud with a dull thud. Then, slowly, deliberately, the king of the northern ridge lowered his massive frame. He bent his right knee. The joint popped in the cold air. His armored shin hit the frozen puddle of mud and pig blood, cracking the ice. He dropped to one knee before her. The silence that followed was so profound, it rang in Rowena's ears. It wasn't just the villagers who were stunned. The vanguard, hardened killers, monsters wearing men's skin, shifted backward, their boots scraping the dirt in collective shock. One of the guards let out a confused, distressed whine. Gideon ignored them. He ignored the mud seeping into his trousers. Kneeling, his face was perfectly level with Rowena's chest. He raised a single, heavily scarred hand. His fingers were thick, tipped with nails that were just a fraction too sharp to be human. He reached toward her. Rowena's survival instincts flared. She wanted to flinch, to swat his hand away, to run. But her boots felt bolted to the ground. She stayed perfectly still as his rough fingers brushed the edge of her woolen collar. He didn't touch her skin. He merely pushed the fabric aside slightly to fully expose the jagged, ugly brand. His yellow eyes traced the lines of the scar. He studied the depth of the burn, the way it had healed over a decade of hard labor and poor medicine. "Red Ridge," Gideon murmured, his breath hot against her cold skin. "My brother's pack. He burned the villages. He burned the women. He marked the ones who fought back, so the rest of the world would know they were broken." Rowena's jaw tightened. "I am not broken." Gideon finally looked up. From his kneeling position, he looked into her eyes. The sheer physical power of the man was utterly at odds with the posture of submission he had just taken. He wasn't bowing to her. He was leveling the field. He was bringing himself down so he could look a survivor in the eye without forcing her to look up. "No," Gideon said softly. "You are not." He dropped his hand and slowly stood back up. The mud clung to his knee guard, a dark, wet stain against the dull steel. He looked at the stain, then back at Rowena. "You are right," Gideon said, his voice carrying across the silent square. "The mud ruins the clothes." He turned his back on her. The vanguard remained frozen. They stared at their king, their minds struggling to process the scene. A Lycan king didn't kneel. A Lycan king didn't yield space to a human. A Lycan king certainly didn't muddy his own armor to validate a peasant's defiance. By the ancient laws of the pack, Gideon should have torn her throat out the moment she refused to lower her head. By kneeling, he had just elevated her status to something undefinable. Something dangerous. "My king," the captain of the vanguard finally choked out, stepping forward. "She insulted the crown. The treaty demands submission from the conquered," Gideon interrupted, not looking at the captain. "She is not conquered. She is marked by my brother's fire, and she stands despite it." Gideon turned his head slightly, looking over his shoulder at Rowena. "What is your name, butcher?" "Rowena," she said, her voice betraying a slight tremor for the first time. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, sharp dread. She had survived the interaction, but she knew enough about Lycan politics to know that survival often came with a worse price. "Rowena of Tarnstead," Gideon repeated. He tested the syllables. "Gather your things." Rowena frowned. "My things?" "Yes, your knives, your boots, whatever you require." Gideon stepped over his discarded fur cloak, leaving it in the mud. "You are coming with us to the capital?" Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Rowena's chest. "I am not part of the tithe. I am over the age limit. The treaty states you only take those under 20 summers. I am not taking you as a tithe," Gideon said. He signaled his men. The vanguard immediately began turning, preparing to march. The heavy atmosphere in the square began to lift, replaced by a frantic, nervous energy. "Then what are you taking me as?" Rowena demanded, stepping forward, ignoring Cobb's desperate grab for her ankle. Gideon paused. He looked at the muddy stain on his knee, then at the jagged brand on her collarbone. A grim, terrifying shadow of a smile touched the corners of his scarred mouth. "A reminder," Gideon said. "My court has grown fat and lazy on our own superiority. They forget that humans have teeth. They forget what endurance looks like. You will stand in my halls, Rowena, and when my lords demand you kneel, you will tell them exactly what you told me." "And if they kill me?" she asked bluntly. Gideon's yellow eyes hardened into something feral. "Let them try." He didn't wait for her to agree. He didn't need to. He began walking back toward the tree line, his massive strides eating up the frozen ground. Rowena stood in the village square. Around her, the villagers were slowly peeling themselves out of the mud, their faces pale, their eyes wide with horror and awe as they stared at her. Cobb was shaking his head, crossing himself frantically. She looked down at the mud. She looked at the abandoned wolf pelt cloak lying in the dirt. It was worth more than her entire village combined. She let out a long, slow breath. The cold air burned her lungs. She reached into her boot, pulled out her butchering knife, and wiped the blade on her apron. "Well," Rowena muttered to herself, "at least I won't have to salt the rest of that damn pig." The march to Ethelgard took 3 days. For Rowena, it was a masterclass in endurance and silent hostility. The vanguard didn't speak to her. They communicated in low grunts, sharp whistles, and the occasional baring of teeth. When they made camp at night, they slept in a tight, impenetrable ring around their king. Rowena was left to huddle by the outer fire, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket she had salvaged from the supply wagon. She slept with her butchering knife tucked against her thigh, the cold iron biting through her trousers. Gideon did not coddle her. He did not offer her his mount, a massive, shaggy draft horse that seemed too mean to be frightened by its rider. He rode at the head of the column, a silent monolith in battered steel. But he was always aware of her. Rowena knew this because every time a vanguard soldier accidentally shouldered her toward a snowbank, or whenever the gap between her and the wagon grew too wide, Gideon's horse would slow. He wouldn't turn around. He would simply halt. The entire column would freeze, the soldiers stiffening as a low, almost imperceptible hum vibrated from the king's chest. The offending soldier would step back, head bowed. Then, the march would resume. He was protecting her, but it wasn't out of kindness. It was possession. She was his point to prove. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the tree line broke, revealing the Lycan capital. Ethelgard was not a city of glittering spires. It was a brutalist monument carved directly into the face of a granite mountain. Massive ramparts of dark grey stone jutted out over a frozen river. There were no decorative banners, no painted glass. The architecture was entirely defensive, built to withstand sieges, harsh winters, and the violent temper tantrums of its inhabitants. Thick plumes of black smoke choked the sky above the keep, smelling of roasted meat and burning pine. "Stay close to the wagon," the vanguard captain, a scarred brute named Eric, muttered to her as they approached the heavy iron gates. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her. "If you wander, the lower packs will eat you before the king even notices you're gone." Rowena adjusted the strap of her pack. Her joints were stiff, her boots caked in 3 days of frozen mud. "If they eat me, I hope I give them indigestion." Eric shot her a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. But he didn't argue. The gates groaned open, screaming on massive iron hinges. The noise inside the courtyard hit Rowena like a physical blow. Hundreds of Lycans moved through the space. Blacksmiths hammered out dented armor, Merchants yelled over the din, and heavily armed guards patrolled the parapets. The moment Gideon rode through the gates, the chaos snapped into absolute, terrifying silence. It was instant. Hammers stopped mid-swing. Voices died in throats. Every single Lycan in the courtyard, men, women, and wide-eyed children, dropped to the freezing cobblestones. They exposed their necks, their bodies trembling with a mix of reverence and primal fear. Rowena walked in behind the wagon. She felt the eyes on her immediately. Even with their heads bowed, the Lycans could smell her. They smelled the human sweat, the fear she kept tightly compressed in her chest, and the old, faded scent of burnt flesh from the Red Ridge brand. Low growls began to ripple through the kneeling crowd. It was a terrifying sound, a collective vibration that traveled up through the soles of Rowena's boots and rattled her teeth. Gideon dismounted. He tossed his reins to a waiting stable hand, who kept his eyes fixed firmly on the king's boots. "Up!" Gideon commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried effortlessly across the stone courtyard. The courtyard rose in unison. The silence remained, thick and oppressive. Their golden, yellow, and amber eyes tracked Gideon, but they inevitably slid toward the human woman, standing casually beside a barrel of salted cod. Gideon turned and walked toward Rowena. The sea of Lycans parted for him, pressing themselves against the stone walls to give him a wide berth. "The march is done," Gideon said, stopping before her. He looked exhausted. The deep lines around his mouth seemed etched in ash. "You will be escorted to the washrooms. Then you will be brought to the great hall." Rowena looked past him, eyeing the hundreds of hostile predators staring at her. "Am I being served for dinner, or just attending?" Gideon's jaw tightened. A muscle ticked in his cheek. "Do not push your luck, Rowena. The courtyard is not the village square. There are factions here that would gladly tear you apart just to spite me." "Then why am I going to the great hall?" "Because my brother's emissaries arrived this morning," Gideon said softly. His yellow eyes locked onto hers, completely devoid of amusement. "Rafe is demanding a wider hunting territory. He claims my reign has made the northern ridge soft. I intend to show them exactly how soft we are." Rowena's stomach dropped. The cold dread she had felt in Tarnstead returned, sharp and precise. Rafe, the architect of the Red Ridge Purge, the monster who had ordered her village burned, who had watched as the hot iron was pressed into her flesh. Her hand twitched toward her boot. Gideon saw the movement. He reached out, his massive hand wrapping around her wrist. His grip was an iron vice, inescapable but entirely lacking in cruelty. "Not your knife," Gideon murmured, leaning in so only she could hear. "Your spine. That is the weapon I need tonight." He released her wrist and turned away, striding toward the heavy oak doors of the inner keep. Rowena stood alone in the freezing courtyard, the collective hatred of 100 werewolves pressing down on her. She rubbed her wrist, feeling the residual heat of the king's skin, and took a slow, deep breath. The great hall of Ethelgard smelled like a slaughterhouse, masquerading as a banquet. Rowena was led through the heavy double doors by 2 guards who walked far enough away to pretend she wasn't with them. She had been given an hour to scrub the grime from her skin in a freezing copper tub and handed a fresh tunic. It was simple, undyed wool, clearly meant for a servant. She had taken her butchering knife from her old clothes and strapped it to her forearm beneath the long sleeve. It was a meager comfort, but it was hers. The hall was cavernous. Massive hearths roared at either end, casting long, flickering shadows against the stone walls. Long wooden tables were crowded with Lycan lords and military commanders, tearing into roasted meat with their bare hands. There were no plates, no forks, just the tearing of flesh, the sloshing of dark ale, and the overwhelming scent of wet dog and arrogance. At the far end, elevated on a dais, sat the king's table. Gideon sat in the center, He had shed his battered armor for a heavy tunic of black leather and a dark velvet mantle. He looked larger without the steel, his broad shoulders dominating the space. When Rowena entered, the noise in the hall did not stop. It shifted. The raucous laughter died, replaced by a low, dangerous murmuring. Forks were dropped. Ale horns were lowered. Hundreds of predatory eyes turned toward the door. "Halt!" a voice barked from the center of the room. Rowena stopped. A Lycan rose from one of the main tables. He was older, his hair a shock of coarse silver. His face was a map of old battles, but his clothes were excessively rich, heavy furs, gold clasps, and a silk tunic that looked absurd against his scarred skin. This was Lord Bram. Bram stepped over the wooden bench, his boots thudding against the stone floor. He walked toward Rowena, his nose twitching. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her neck. "What is this filth?" Bram demanded, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He didn't address Rowena. He looked past her, toward the guards at the door. "Why is a human tracking mud into the great hall? The kitchens are through the lower bailey." Rowena kept her face blank. She focused on the heavy timber beams above Bram's head. From the dais, Gideon's voice cut through the heavy air. "She is not for the kitchens, Bram. She is my guest." The hall went dead silent. The crackle of the hearth fires sounded like deafening snaps in the quiet. Bram whipped his head toward the dais, his silver hair flying. "Guest? My king, you jest. We do not host livestock. If she is the winter tithe, send her to the pens. If she is a pet, leash her." Rowena felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks, but she bit the inside of her cheek hard, letting the metallic taste of copper ground her. She would not react. She would not give them the satisfaction. "She is Rowena of Tarnstead," Gideon said smoothly, leaning back in his heavy wooden chair. He picked up an iron goblet and took a slow drink. "And she does not kneel. Not to the vanguard. Not to me. I thought the court might benefit from observing such rare fortitude." Bram's face contorted into a snarl. His upper lip curled back, exposing elongated canines. He turned his attention fully to Rowena, stepping so close she could smell the sour wine on his breath. "Does not kneel," Bram hissed. He raised a massive hand, his claws fully extended, and rested them lightly on Rowena's left shoulder. It was a clear, undeniable threat. Every human kneels. It is their nature. They grovel, they bleed, and they die. "Kneel, girl." Rowena looked at the hand on her shoulder. The claws were pressing slightly into the wool, just grazing her skin. She calculated the distance to his throat. She calculated the speed of his reflexes. She knew she would lose. She looked past Bram, straight down the length of the hall, directly into Gideon's flat yellow eyes. He was watching her. The entire hall was holding its breath, waiting for the slaughter. Rowena slowly turned her head and looked up into Bram's furious face. "You're stepping on my boots," she said. Bram blinked. The sheer absurdity of the statement short-circuited his rage for a fraction of a second. He looked down. His heavy iron-toed boot was indeed pressing against the toe of her worn leather shoe. "Move it," Rowena said, her voice completely flat. A sound erupted from the king's table. It was sharp, loud, and entirely unexpected. It was a laugh. Gideon was laughing. It was a rusty, grating sound, like he hadn't used those muscles in a decade, but it boomed across the hall. The lords looked at their king in horror. A Lycan king did not laugh at the embarrassment of his own lords. It was a display of utter disrespect. Bram's face flushed a deep, violent purple. He ripped his hand from Rowena's shoulder. "Insolence! You allow this creature to mock us in our own halls? You disgrace the pack, Gideon." Gideon's laughter vanished instantly. The shift was terrifying. The heavy, oppressive aura of the apex predator, slammed down on the room, suffocating the air. Gideon stood. He didn't rush. He simply unfolded his massive frame from the chair and stepped down from the dais. He walked down the center aisle, the lords scrambling to pull their legs out of his path. He stopped next to Bram. Gideon was taller, broader, and infinitely more dangerous. He looked down at the older lord. "You forget yourself, Bram," Gideon said, his voice a lethal, vibrating hum. "You speak of disgrace, while you stand here threatening a butcher from a mud village because she bruised your fragile ego. You want her to kneel?" Gideon reached out, grabbing the collar of Rowena's tunic. He didn't pull hard, but he dragged the fabric down, exposing her right collarbone. The jagged, ugly brand of the crescent moon and slash caught the flickering firelight. Gasps rippled through the hall. Several lords stood up, their chairs scraping violently against the stone. "Red Ridge!" Gideon projected his voice, ensuring every Lycan in the room heard him. "My brother Rafe's handiwork. He tried to break her 10 years ago. He failed. She stood before my vanguard and refused the dirt. You, Bram, whine about your pride while she carries the scars of our own savagery. Without a flinch." Gideon let go of her tunic. He turned his dead, yellow eyes to the far corner of the room, where 3 Lycans clad in crimson leather sat in silence. Rafe's emissaries. "Tell my brother," Gideon said, his voice dripping with venom, "that the northern ridge does not need a wider hunting ground. Tell him we are perfectly capable of breaking our own prey. And tell him that if he ever sends his fire into my territory again, I will not mark his survivors. I will leave none." The emissaries didn't move. They simply stared at Gideon, their eyes burning with calculated hatred. Gideon turned back to Bram. "Sit down, Lord Bram, before I decide you've outlived your usefulness to the council." Bram swallowed hard, his throat clicking. He bowed his head stiffly, completely subdued by the sheer dominance of the king, and practically fled back to his table. Gideon looked at Rowena. His chest was heaving slightly, the beast within him dangerously close to the surface. He gestured sharply to a small, empty table near the hearth. "Eat," Gideon commanded her. "And if anyone bothers you, stab them with your dinner knife." He turned and walked back to the dais, leaving a stunned, breathless hall in his wake. Rowena stood there for a moment, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She walked to the small table, sat down, and pulled a roasted grouse toward her. She picked up the small iron dinner knife, tested the edge with her thumb, and then looked around the room. Every Lycan was actively avoiding her gaze. For the first time since winter began, Rowena smiled. The bedchamber they gave her was not a cell, but it wasn't a guest suite either. It was a high tower room, with narrow, glassless windows designed for archers, letting in a bitter draught that cut right through the stone. A meager fire crackled in a tiny hearth. The bed was a heavy oak frame, with furs instead of blankets. Rowena sat on the edge of the mattress, systematically unlacing her boots. Her hands were shaking. The adrenaline that had kept her spine straight in the great hall was finally bleeding out, leaving her hollow and nauseous. She had mocked a Lycan lord. She had been used as a political prop by a king. And she was currently locked in a fortress, surrounded by monsters who wanted to peel her skin off. She pulled her butchering knife from her forearm strap and laid it on the heavy oak bedside table. It looked pathetic. A piece of sharpened iron against an army of regenerating, superhuman killers. A soft scrape of leather against stone made her freeze. She hadn't heard the heavy iron door open. She hadn't heard footsteps. But when she looked up, Gideon was standing in the shadows near the doorway. He had stripped off his velvet mantle. He wore only the dark leather tunic, unlaced at the throat, revealing the thick, knotted scars that covered his chest. "You move too quietly for something that size," Rowena said, keeping her voice level. She didn't reach for the knife. If he wanted her dead, she'd be dead before her fingers touched the hilt. Gideon stepped into the dim firelight. The exhaustion she had seen in the courtyard was back, heavier now. He looked like a man carrying the mountain rather than living inside it. "It is a necessary skill," Gideon replied, leaning against the stone wall. He crossed his massive arms. "Loud kings are usually short-lived kings. Did you come to gloat?" Rowena asked, pulling her knees up to her chest, resting her chin on them. "You got your little performance. You used me to insult your brother and terrify your lords. I hope it was worth the mud on your armor." Gideon didn't bristle at her tone. He just watched her. His yellow eyes were softer in the firelight, the predatory edge dulled by fatigue. "It wasn't a performance. It was a declaration," Gideon said quietly. "Rafe is rallying the southern packs. He believes humans are a plague, meant to be eradicated or kept in cages. He thinks my treaties are a sign of weakness. He wants to march on the human capitals." Rowena frowned. "And bringing a human to your court stops that?" "No." Gideon sighed, running a heavy hand over his face. "It accelerates it. It forces his hand. The traditionalists in my own court, like Bram, have been secretly sending coin to Rafe. They want him to challenge me. But they are cowards. They won't strike unless they feel their pride has been irreparably damaged." Rowena stared at him, piecing the politics together. Her stomach dropped further. "You used me as bait." "Yes." The blunt honesty knocked the wind out of her. She expected a lie, she expected a justification, but he just stood there, unapologetic. "You brought me here to make them so angry they do something stupid," Rowena summarized, her voice trembling with sudden, sharp anger. "You paraded my scars in front of them to provoke a war. The war is already here, Rowena," Gideon said, pushing off the wall and taking a step toward her. The sheer mass of him ate up the small room. "Rafe has been burning border villages for 6 months. I have been bleeding my vanguard dry, trying to stop him quietly. But my council will not vote for a full mobilization unless the threat is at our gates. So I brought the insult to them." "And what happens to the bait when the trap snaps shut?" she demanded, sliding off the bed, standing to face him. She was dwarfed by his shadow, but she tipped her chin up, refusing to back down. "I get torn apart in the crossfire. I survive a purge just to die in a wolf's political game?" Gideon looked down at her. He reached out. Rowena flinched, but she didn't step back. His rough fingers brushed the side of her neck, tracing the edge of her woolen collar right over the brand. His touch was shockingly gentle, a jarring contrast to the violence he was capable of. His skin was unnaturally warm, radiating a deep, furnace-like heat against the freezing draft of the room. "You will not die here," Gideon said. His voice was a low rumble, vibrating in his chest. It wasn't a promise. It was an absolute command. "You are under my protection. The mark Rafe gave you meant you were broken. The fact that you are standing here means he failed. You are living proof that his ideology is flawed." "I don't care about your ideology," Rowena whispered fiercely, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could smell him now, the dark pine, the ozone, the distinct scent of blood and power. It was intoxicating and terrifying. "I care about living." Gideon's eyes locked onto hers. The golden yellow burned intensely in the dim light. He leaned in slightly, his face mere inches from hers. "Then live, Rowena," he murmured, his breath brushing her lips. "Be the splinter in their eye. Be the human who refuses to bow. Because the angrier they get at you, the closer they step to my blade." He lingered for a second longer, the proximity heavy with a sudden, suffocating tension. Rowena felt a strange heat bloom in her chest, a dangerous mixture of fear and something far more foolish. He was using her, but he was also the only thing standing between her and a fortress of monsters. Gideon pulled back abruptly, breaking the spell. He turned toward the door. "Lock the iron deadbolt," he instructed, his back to her. "Do not open it until I come for you tomorrow. There will be meat and bread brought to the guard outside. He will pass it through the slot." "Gideon!" Rowena called out before he could open the heavy door. He paused, glancing over his shoulder. "If I'm going to be your bait," she said, her voice steadying into its usual cynical drawl, "I want better boots. These are giving me blisters." A slow, genuine smirk tugged at the scarred corner of the Lycan King's mouth. It changed his entire face, wiping away the exhaustion for a fleeting moment. "I will see to it," he said softly. The heavy iron door closed behind him with a deafening thud. Rowena stood in the silence, listening to the heavy scrape of the deadbolt sliding into place from the outside. She was trapped. She was bait. She walked over to the bed, picked up her butchering knife, and slid it under the fur pillow. She lay down in the cold room, staring at the stone ceiling, listening to the distant, haunting sound of wolves howling into the winter night. The boots arrived at dawn. They were shoved through the narrow gap beneath the iron door, hitting the stone floor with a heavy, satisfying thud. Rowena slid off the mattress, the freezing air biting at her bare ankles. She picked them up. They were black leather, thick-soled, lined with dense sheep's wool, and smelled of mink oil and fresh pine. They were undeniably masculine, and roughly half a size too big, but they were a staggering improvement over her rotting village shoes. She laced them up. The stiff leather bit into her shins, a grounding physical pain that helped clear the fog of a sleepless night. A heavy knock rattled the door before the deadbolt scraped back. It was Eric, the vanguard captain. He looked at her with the same flat hostility as before, but his eyes dropped to the boots. A muscle flickered in his jaw. "The king requires you in the lower courtyard," Eric grunted. "Walk in the center of the corridor. Do not speak to anyone." Rowena adjusted the leather strap, binding the butchering knife to her forearm, hiding it beneath her sleeve. "Lead the way." Aethelgard in the daylight was no less oppressive than it was at night. The corridors were vast, drafty arteries of rough-hewn stone. There were no tapestries to absorb the sound. Every footstep echoed. As they descended into the bowels of the keep, the air grew noticeably colder, carrying the sharp, metallic tang of the armory and the damp musk of the subterranean levels. They turned a corner into a long, windowless hall, lit by sputtering torches. Eric suddenly stopped. His massive shoulders tensed. The hair on the back of his neck bristled, visibly pushing against his leather collar. Rowena felt it a second later. A shift in the air pressure. A low, wet vibration coming from the shadows ahead. 3 Lycans stepped out from the intersecting corridor. They wore the crimson leather of Rafe's emissaries. They were partially shifted. Their jaws were elongated, their fingernails had extended into thick, curved talons, and their eyes were blown wide, pupil-less pools of flat gold. Eric drew his broadsword. The scrape of steel was deafening in the enclosed space. "Stand down. You are under guest right." The lead emissary let out a gurgling laugh that sounded like a wet cough. "Guest right extends to Lycan's vanguard, not to livestock. Lord Bram agrees." The mention of Bram confirmed everything Gideon had predicted. The trap was springing. The traditionalists had allied with Rafe's men. "Get behind me!" Eric barked at Rowena, shifting his weight into a defensive stance. He didn't get the chance to strike. The 3 emissaries lunged simultaneously. They didn't fight like soldiers. They fought like a starving pack. 2 hit Eric high, their sheer mass slamming the vanguard captain against the stone wall. Stone cracked. Eric roared, his sword burying itself to the hilt in the nearest attacker's gut, but the Lycan barely flinched, snapping its jaws toward Eric's throat. The 3rd emissary ignored Eric entirely. He locked eyes with Rowena and dropped to all fours, scrambling across the stone floor with terrifying speed. Rowena didn't scream. Fear was a luxury she had burned out of her system 10 years ago. Her mind snapped into a cold, hyper-focused state. She saw the mass. She saw the trajectory. She didn't run backward. She threw herself forward and dropped. The Lycan vaulted over her, expecting her to flee. Its massive, clawed feet slammed into the stone where she had just been standing. As it passed over her, Rowena rolled onto her back, her left hand snapping up her right sleeve. Her fingers closed around the wooden hilt of her butchering knife. She thrust upward. She didn't aim for the chest or the stomach. Thick muscle and bone would snap her blade instantly. She aimed for the soft, unarmored joint behind the Lycan's knee. The iron blade sank deep into the meat of the Lycan's thigh. Rowena gripped the hilt with both hands and ripped downward with all her strength. The emissary let out an ear-piercing shriek. The blade severed the hamstring completely. Black, hot blood sprayed across Rowena's face and chest. The massive creature collapsed, its leg buckling uselessly beneath it, crashing shoulder first into the stone wall. Rowena scrambled to her feet, her new boots gripping the blood-slicked floor perfectly. She didn't stay to admire her work. She backed away rapidly, wiping the hot blood from her eyes. The emissary thrashed on the ground, snapping its jaws, trying to drag itself toward her by its front claws. Its eyes were fixed on her, burning with rabid fury. Before it could pull itself forward, a shadow engulfed the corridor. Gideon didn't run into the hall. He hit it like a siege engine. He was fully shifted. The king of the northern ridge was a towering, 9-foot nightmare of charcoal fur, roped muscle and scarred flesh. He didn't use a weapon. He grabbed the crippled emissary by the back of the neck with one massive, clawed hand. The crunch of the cervical spine snapping echoed like a dry branch breaking in a silent forest. Gideon tossed the dead Lycan aside like a ragged doll. He turned toward the other two, who were still wrestling Eric to the ground. Gideon let out a roar. It wasn't a sound a human throat could comprehend. It rattled Rowena's ribs. It knocked the soot from the torches. The two emissaries froze. They let go of Eric and turned toward the apex predator. The fight left them instantly. The biological imperative to submit to the king overrode their orders. They hit the stone floor, exposing their necks, whining pitifully. Gideon did not accept their submission. He crossed the distance in a single bound. He crushed the skull of the first under his heel. He grabbed the second by the throat, lifting the massive creature entirely off the ground. The emissary kicked wildly, choking, until Gideon's jaws clamped down on its throat. A quick, brutal wrench of his neck, and the third assassin was dead. The corridor fell deathly silent, save for the heavy, wet panting of the king and the dripping of blood onto the stone. Gideon dropped the body. He stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving, his claws dripping thick black blood. He turned his massive, wolfish head toward Rowena. His muzzle was stained crimson. His eyes were entirely feral. The beast was fully in control. Rowena stood her ground. Her heart was beating so fast it blurred into a continuous ache. Her butchering knife hung loosely in her right hand, dripping. She was covered in the first Lycan's blood. The massive werewolf took a slow, heavy step toward her. A low growl vibrated in his chest. Eric, bleeding heavily from a shoulder wound, tried to push himself up. "My king, no!" Gideon ignored him. He stopped inches from Rowena. The heat coming off his body was unbearable. He leaned down, his massive, blood-stained muzzle pressing close to her face. He inhaled deeply, taking in the scent of her sweat, the fresh blood, and the metallic tang of fear she couldn't hide. Rowena stared directly into the golden fire of his eyes. She slowly raised her left hand, exposing the scarred brand on her collarbone, and held his gaze. "I'm still standing," she whispered. The feral fire in Gideon's eyes flickered. The monstrous, twisted muscles of his face twitched. Slowly, agonizingly, the king began to pull himself back from the brink. The bone-deep popping of his shift echoed in the hall as he forced his anatomy back into its human shape. He collapsed to one knee, a naked, heavily scarred man kneeling in a pool of blood. He rested his forehead against the cold stone, his chest heaving as he dragged air into his human lungs. "Bram," Gideon gasped out, his voice utterly wrecked. He moved too early. Rowena wiped her knife on her blood-soaked tunic and slid it back into its sheath. She looked down at the king. "Then let's go kill him," she said. The lower courtyard was a chaotic mass of howling flesh and ringing steel. Bram had not just sent assassins. He had triggered a full coup. Half the vanguard remained loyal to the king, locking shields in a brutal defensive ring at the base of the armory steps. The other half, swayed by Bram's gold and Rafe's promises of human slaughter, battered against them. When Gideon emerged from the subterranean keep, draped in a heavy chainmail hauberk Eric had stripped from the armory, the battle stalled. Gideon stepped into the weak winter sunlight. He carried his massive broadsword. He did not yell. He did not rally his troops. He simply walked down the steps, his presence sinking into the courtyard like a heavy stone into a dark pond. Behind him stood Eric, clutching a fresh battle-axe, and beside Eric stood Rowena. She was smeared in dried blood, her face pale, but her jaw set tight. She had retrieved a short, heavy iron mace from the armory floor. She barely knew how to swing it, but it felt better than the butchering knife. Across the courtyard, Lord Bram stood surrounded by his loyalists. He was shifted entirely, a massive wolf with stark silver fur, his jaws dripping with saliva. When he saw Gideon, he let out a challenging roar that shook the frost from the parapets. "He's relying on the pack law," Eric muttered, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the cobblestones. "A direct challenge. If he kills you, the loyalists have to stand down. It's the old way." "The old way is exactly what I am burying today," Gideon replied flatly. He stepped out of the defensive ring. He didn't shift. Fighting in human form against a fully shifted Lycan was considered suicidal, a profound disadvantage in mass, speed, and lethal weaponry. But Gideon wanted to make a point. He wanted to break the traditionalists, not just defeat them. Bram charged. The silver wolf cleared 20 feet in a single bound, launching himself directly at Gideon's chest. Gideon didn't brace. He pivoted. As Bram's massive jaws snapped shut on empty air, Gideon swung the broadsword with a terrifying two-handed arc. The heavy steel caught Bram in the ribs. The sound of metal shattering bone cracked like a thunderclap. Bram hit the ground hard, tumbling across the frozen cobblestones. But Lycans healed fast, and adrenaline fueled the beast. Bram scrambled up, ignoring the gaping wound in his side, and lunged again. This time he caught Gideon. Bram's heavy front claws slammed into Gideon's chest, ripping through the chainmail like it was linen. The king was thrown backward, crashing into the stone steps. Bram was on him instantly, jaws snapping for the throat. Rowena's grip tightened on the mace. She took a step forward, but Eric grabbed her arm, hauling her back. "You interfere in a king's challenge, they will tear you to pieces, regardless of who wins. Hold your ground." Gideon caught Bram's throat with his left hand, holding the snapping jaws inches from his face. The muscles in Gideon's arm bulged, veins standing out like thick ropes against his scarred skin. Bram dug his hind claws into Gideon's thighs, trying to disembowel him. "You are weak," Bram snarled, his voice a guttural wet distortion through his wolf throat. "You protect cattle. You disgrace the blood." "I protect the kingdom," Gideon grunted, blood spilling from his lips. "You protect your ego." Gideon let go of his sword. With his free right hand, he reached up and buried his thick fingers directly into the open wound on Bram's ribs. Bram shrieked, a high-pitched sound of absolute agony. Gideon twisted his grip, hooking his fingers behind Bram's ribcage. With a roar of exertion that finally betrayed the beast lurking beneath his human skin, Gideon tore backward. Bone snapped, flesh ripped. Bram was thrown off him, collapsing onto the frozen mud, thrashing violently. The silver wolf tried to rise, but the structural damage was too severe. He lay there, wheezing, his yellow eyes wide with shock and fading arrogance. Gideon stood up slowly. He was bleeding profusely from his chest and legs, his chainmail ruined. He walked over to where his broadsword lay, picked it up, and dragged it across the cobblestones toward Bram. The screech of the metal filled the stunned silence of the courtyard. He stood over the dying lord. "The northern ridge does not bow to the south," Gideon stated, his voice carrying to every corner of the frozen courtyard. "We do not burn villages for sport. We do not cull the weak to pretend we are strong. Endurance is our strength." Gideon raised the sword. "And treason is our only absolute crime." The blade came down. Bram's head rolled across the frost. Gideon drove the point of his sword into the frozen mud and leaned heavily against the hilt. He looked out at the rebel vanguard. They were staring at their dead leader, their morale entirely broken. Slowly, one by one, the rebels dropped to their knees. They pressed their foreheads to the freezing, blood-stained cobblestones, exposing their necks to the king they had just tried to butcher. Gideon didn't tell them to rise. He turned his back on them. He walked up the steps toward the keep. His right leg dragged slightly. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the crushing reality of his wounds. He stopped in front of Rowena. He looked at the heavy iron mace in her hand. He looked at the blood smeared across her cheek. "You didn't run," he noted, his voice a hoarse rasp. "My new boots fit perfectly," Rowena said, her voice shaking slightly, betraying the sheer terror she was finally allowing herself to feel. It seemed a waste not to stand in them. A faint, blood-stained smile touched Gideon's lips. His eyes rolled back, and the king of the northern ridge collapsed onto the freezing stone. The king's chambers were vast, Spartan, and smelled sharply of alcohol and copper. Gideon lay face down on a heavy oak table in the center of the room. Eric had peeled the ruined chainmail and shredded tunic from his back. The wounds were horrific. 4 deep, parallel gouges tore across his right shoulder blade and down his ribs, the flesh hanging in ragged strips. The royal physician, an ancient Lycan with cloudy eyes, was shaking his head. "The beast will heal the muscle in time, but the skin must be closed. He is bleeding out faster than his blood can replace it. My hands shake too much for the needle." "Give it to me," Rowena said. She stood by the wash basin, having scrubbed her hands until they were raw. She took the curved bone needle and the spool of boiled gut thread from the physician. She didn't ask for permission. She walked to the table. "Hold him down," she told Eric. The Vanguard captain frowned. "He is unconscious." "He won't be when I start. Hold him." Rowena wiped the excess blood from the first wound with a linen cloth soaked in raw spirits. Gideon groaned, the heavy muscles of his back twitching violently. Rowena didn't hesitate. She drove the bone needle through the thick, rubbery edge of the Lycan's skin, pulling it tight across the gap, and pushed it through the other side. Gideon's eyes flew open. A muffled feral snarl ripped from his throat. Eric threw his entire body weight over the king's legs, pinning him to the wood. "Quiet," Rowena ordered sharply, her hands moving with the steady, mechanical precision of a butcher closing a stuffed flank. "Save your energy. You have a kingdom to clean up." Gideon dug his fingers into the edge of the oak table, the wood splintering under his grip. He turned his head, his cheek pressed against the rough grain, and watched her. Her face was a mask of pure concentration. There was no pity in her eyes, no gentle bedside manner. She was entirely pragmatic, treating his flesh with the same objective efficiency she applied to survival. "You stitch well," Gideon grunted, his voice tight with pain. "I cure meat for a living," Rowena said, tying off a knot and snipping the gut thread with a pair of iron shears. She moved to the next laceration. Skin is skin. It took 2 hours. The fire in the hearth burned down to glowing embers by the time Rowena tied the final knot. Gideon's back was a roadmap of brutal, thick sutures. It was ugly work, but the bleeding had stopped. Eric stepped back, exhausted. "I will secure the armory and inventory the prisoners. The courtyard is clear. Throw Bram's body to the ravens," Gideon commanded, his voice muffled by the table. "Send his head to Rafe. Let my brother know the border is closed." Eric bowed stiffly and left the chamber. The heavy iron door clicked shut. Rowena dropped the bloody needle into a brass bowl. She poured water from a pitcher over her hands, watching the pink water spiral down the basin. Every muscle in her body ached. The adrenaline crash was making her hands tremble violently now that the work was done. "You are shaking," Gideon observed softly. "I'm tired," Rowena replied, gripping the edge of the wash basin to steady herself. "It's been a long week. I was supposed to be salting pork." Gideon slowly pushed himself up. He sat on the edge of the table, his heavily sutured back rigid. He looked at her. The feral king of the courtyard was gone. The exhausted, burdened man remained. "Rafe will declare war," Gideon said quietly. "In the spring, when the snows melt, he will march on the northern ridge. He will come for me. And because of the brand on your chest, and the fact that you stood beside me, he will come for you." Rowena turned to face him. She leaned against the wash basin, crossing her arms over her chest. "I know. I cannot send you back to Tarnstead," Gideon continued, his flat yellow eyes locking onto hers. "It would be a death sentence. And I will not lock you in a tower as a ward. You have proven you do not belong in a cage." "So what happens now?" Rowena asked. The cynicism was there, but the sharp edge was gone. It was a genuine question. Gideon stood. He was a battered, ruined mess of a man, covered in blood and crude stitches, but his presence still filled the room. He walked slowly toward her, stopping just out of arm's reach. "You stay," Gideon said. It wasn't a royal decree, it was a request. "The court needs a reminder that they are not invincible, and I need a reminder of what we are fighting for. You do not bow, Rowena. You endure. I need that in my halls." Rowena looked up at him. She thought of her freezing village. She thought of the fear that dictated every human life outside these walls. She looked at the scarred monster in front of her, who had bled out his own kin to defend an ideal that kept her alive. "If I stay," Rowena said, her voice steady, "I'm not eating in the kitchens, and I'm not wearing rags. I want a proper coat. Winter is coming, and your castle is drafty." Gideon stared at her for a long moment. Then, a slow, genuine smile broke across his scarred face. It reached his eyes, turning the flat yellow into a warm, burning gold. "Done," the Lycan king said. He reached out, his rough, blood-stained hand gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. She didn't flinch. She leaned into the touch, a silent acknowledgement of the brutal, necessary partnership they had just forged in blood. They were two survivors, scarred by the same fire, standing together in the cold, and neither of them was kneeling. And that is the end of Rowena and Gideon's bloody, brutal start. If you loved this grounded, gritty take on a werewolf romance where the human refuses to be a victim, smash that like button. Did Rowena's survival skills impress you? Drop a comment below and let me know if you want to see a sequel where they face Rafe's army in the spring. Don't forget to share this video with your fantasy-loving friends and hit subscribe with notifications on so you never miss Another dark, epic story on the channel. See you in the next one.